thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. It's the latest in a series of webinars provided by Erin Mitchell in lockdown. We're now 50 odd days into lockdown, can you believe? And given the most recent government guidance, which is the term I think most of us have used quite loosely, it looks as though the current situation will be our new normal for some time yet. I know I'm finding what was a novel situation quite challenging at times, and I don't have children other than an unruly furloughed husband. And I'm even more aware that seriously injured and vulnerable clients that we work with are finding the situation particularly difficult. I know from speaking to my own clients, they're expressing a wide range of issues from physical deterioration, increasing anxieties and mental health issues, frustration, adjustment issues, and sometimes they just don't have the capacity to understand why they aren't able to leave their home, why they need to socially distance, and the risks of COVID-19. So in such unique and challenging times, we wanted to bring together our fabulous network of colleagues and contacts to consider the ways we can support our vulnerable and seriously injured clients and get thinking creatively. We want you all to leave the webinar today feeling as though you've got the support and the tools to effectively support our clients in the best way possible. Hence the aptly named title of the webinar, Supporting the Seriously Injured Through COVID-19 Litigation and Case Management. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Laura McElduff and I'm an Associate Solicitor specialising in serious injury in the Newcastle office. I'll be providing you with an update in relation to the litigation and any possible impacts of COVID-19. I'm also delighted to introduce Vicky Gilman, the Managing Director and Case Manager of Social Return Case Management, giving us a wave in the corner. And Vicky will be providing the insight into the trials and tribulations of case management in a global pandemic. By way of housekeeping, if there are any technical issues, just know that I cannot help you because you've probably already heard I'm terrible with IT. I don't think Vicky's much better than me either. However, technical support and Natasha from our marketing team are on hand to help with any audio and visual issues you might have. So you can use the chat function, which I've mentioned earlier on the toolbar on your screen, direct it to technical support or Erin Mitchell, and you should be able to get a response from them. The other housekeeping issue is questions. Thanks to those of you who've already submitted questions in advance of the webinar. We've tried to ensure that they're answered throughout the course of the presentation, but if not, we'll pick them up at the end. Please also feel free to submit any questions during the course of the presentation by clicking on the Q&A, which should be down here. If I think I'm where I am on your screen, you can select to all panelists so we can see them. We'll also be recording this webinar today and sending it out to you afterwards, so don't worry about taking notes. And lastly, for those of you who've already sent me messages saying you've only signed up to this webinar to either see my husband wandering topless or troll me with his TikTok videos whilst I'm working, I'm really sorry to disappoint. He's locked out of the study until the webinar is over. So now introductions have been made. I'll hand over to Vicky to kick us off with case management in COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Laura, and welcome everybody, and I hope you'll enjoy this next session. So, yes, we're going to have a think through case management in unprecedented times and adjusting to the new normal, or indeed normals, plural, since things keep changing. I've got to get my head around advancing slides and reading my notes here. I did think about actually calling this session business as usual, because dealing with unprecedented circumstances in our clients' lives and supporting them as they establish their new normal is what case managers do. And for many, change continues to occur and require adjustment and readjustment over time. So in that regard, things are not so different, perhaps. But clearly, the whole situation for the nation in its entirety is without precedent. And so although in many ways the work feels somewhat familiar, and it could be argued that case managers are extremely well placed to guide, support and problem solve through challenge and change, it is on the other hand kind of being like asked to do so with your hands tied behind your back. And I'm sure other people are feeling the same in their roles. So my aim today is to share some collected insights from case managers, not only at Social Return where I work, but also across a number of organisations. And the generous sharing of information between case managers has never been more valuable and important, in my view, than right now. And I wanted particularly to mention the organisations Babacom, CMS UK and VRA, who are providing online support and opportunities to connect and to share with peers in the wider network, because I think that's crucial, and I will mention the sharing of information more than once as we go through. So, riding the Coronacoaster. I added this here really to remind me to point out to you that it's perhaps unprecedented for our clients. What is perhaps more unprecedented for them is that everyone around them is also experiencing big shifts in and moving along their own personal change curve. And we're all moving back and forth along the curve, dwelling at points for differing amounts of time. And that has an impact on coping mechanisms, tolerance levels, resilience, etc. This is the backdrop for us all, as I'm sure we're only too aware. And it keeps changing. I've always liked this quote from Maya Angelou because I think this relates very well to case management. Again, this is normal for case managers, the fact that things keep changing. We don't always start out knowing what the answer should be straight away. We seek to understand, to gather information, to get to grips with knowing more, and then we do better. Behind that, we have structures, goals, assessment protocols, standards, outcome measures, all the things we're familiar with, but they've only ever been part of the picture because not everything can be codified. The process at the moment, I think, is more dynamic than usual. That's one of the big differences. For many, there is an increased need to deconstruct and reconstruct plans, methods, recommendations, and inputs. And I also note that parts of life seem to have simplified and slowed down, and I think we're all very aware of that. But on the other hand, thinking, planning, learning, that feels like it's sped up exponentially often. And so there are continual developments. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of where I think we've got to, as case managers have been deepening our learning on how best to achieve things for our clients. I'm going to use some real stories as well to illustrate some of the points. So how are our clients coping? Get asked that question quite a bit. And I thought I'd start with a story told by a case management colleague, Tim Watson, who described in another webinar a trio of clients, but I think they exemplify quite a lot of what we're finding, this variability between how clients are coping. Some clients have anxieties and fears, concerns, confusion, anger, some of the things that Laura mentioned there. It's very challenging, but not for all. Some are doing really well in this simplified, less demanding, more rule-bound world at a somewhat slower pace. And perhaps it isn't always what we're expecting. So the trio of clients that Tim described and has generously allowed me to pinch for this session as well, just illustrate this well, I think. So he was talking about one client, they're all male and have an acquired brain injury, and one client has always been socially isolated and happily so. And lockdown has been suiting him very well. And ironically, he now has more contact than before as professionals check his well-being regularly. And I think this is a story many people will recognise. I've heard this several times over, that there are definitely clients out there who are finding this simplified world a bit of an easier one, actually. His second client also tended to be quite socially isolated before the pandemic, but in a turn of events, and probably because it's quieter out now, he's spending a lot of time out of his house and not understanding the rules fully, which I don't think was what was expected at all. And this is giving Tim, I think, quite a bit of work to do. The third client that he described tends to like to break the rules, test boundaries, and has refused to stay at home and observe social distancing rules. But in a typical, I think, piece of great case management, the thinking was to persuade the client that the deputy will not pay the fines that he will incur if he breaks the rules, and that's actually kept him at home following the rules. So as ever, it's figuring out what will motivate the client, and sometimes not addressing things in quite a direct way is the way forward. again, this is normal for case managers, I think. I've heard a lot of stories of case managers and therapists noticing fewer issues of fatigue for clients as life is slowed and simplified. On the other hand, emotional and behavioural issues for some have increased, often prompted by anxiety. And we have a client who is somewhat disinhibited and highly anxious about others keeping distance from her, and has suggested that she will spit at people to keep them away. This is driven by anxiety, and so there's a lot of case management work to do to manage the anxieties in order to help her control this kind of unacceptable and risky behaviour. For all of us, there's a reduction of the richness and variety in life. Myself and a psychology colleague were theorising about a client who can't hold on to any sense of the pandemic and lockdown yet, for whom challenging behaviours apparently related to frustration are on the increase. Now, we know this client learns routines over time with huge amounts of repetition, and we were surmising that 7 weeks, which was the point at which we were discussing it, of far less variety in activity may at some automatic level be felt as change, even where she can't articulate or hold on to that change. Obviously, there's still lots of work with families, and families are understandably anxious about risks, about not seeing loved ones, having to learn to use unfamiliar technology. Some try to get around the rules to visit. One of our clients' family members may or may not have a tent in the back garden that has been spotted. Other families have stopped carers working due to infection control fears. Some families that have wanted to dispense with support work have perhaps seized the opportunity to do so. And furlough has been quite helpful in many situations where care can't go in for whatever reason at the moment, but we want to maintain it in the long run. So that's just a few stories. I'm sure people on this webinar have loads of their own stories, and I'd love to hear more stories. I think we need to gather this kind of information. So thinking then about some of the new ways in which we're working, and video being one of the key new tools, if you like, that I think we're all using. Wanted to have a little think rather than which platform to think about some of the deepened learning I think we're now coming to after several weeks of using this. Certainly initially, I think there was a flurry of purchasing tablets, smartphones, dongles, more data, checking connections and contracts, and definitely trying to find what the heck the iPad password is. That seemed to crop up fairly frequently. But once deciding to use video, well, I think before that, there's a step of thinking about whether it is indeed the right medium. It's not automatically the best, it's an option, and not forgetting some of the other options. Phone or a mixture of media can be good, and certainly aspects of deep listening using the phone can be very revealing. But if one is deciding that video is the right way forward, then planning that is really important. The first step is setting up work, about the devices, the software, access support, internet connection, the environment. But also thinking about what do you want to see? Do you want to just see a facial expression? Do you want to see a little bit more gesture and posture? Each offers something different. And when you narrow the range down, what you pick up can also deepen. So I think we're beginning to learn more about exactly what we can get and how best to use it, and thinking about that beforehand is part of how to get the most out of it for the client and for yourself. There is something about which platform is best for the situation. I'm not an expert on that, but I have noticed that some are easier to get people onto if they have no real technical knowledge or ability. Others are maybe more intuitive once set up. In large meetings, big MDT meetings, for example, then thinking about observing the clients and family members when they're not speaking, just as you would in the room in real life, is often possible, and that can help you gauge how people may be feeling. And following up afterwards with perhaps a household member to check out things you've noticed. You know, when X was being discussed, he looked like he really wasn't very happy with that, and then the family member might say, actually, that's when the cat came in the room and that was really annoying him, so don't think it was that. So you can get a bit more context in some other ways. The video on its own is perhaps a little bit thinner, but perhaps we can find ways to pick up more. Minimizing video fatigue is important, and I think we need a new word for video fatigue. I can't think what it is, but I think we're probably all getting familiar with it. And if it's tiring for us, then it's certainly tiring for our clients. And I think we're all now recognizing the need to keep things short, to think about the intensity, to spread things apart in terms of video sessions, including perhaps the social ones that might intersperse some of the more therapeutic ones with other professionals. There's something about direct and indirect use of video platforms, by which I'm thinking about physios, for example, who are reporting that there are huge benefits to looking at bed positioning with night staff, something they may not have thought about doing before, but because we're all getting familiar with video technology, that's been a real benefit. Also, whether you want the screen to be in front of the client, it could be a distraction. You may want to have that to one side and be indirectly looking at something that's happening and being the observer, rather than necessarily actually directly interacting with the client. So there are lots of different ways, I think, that we're starting to discover that we can use this technology and develop our use of this tool. But overall, I guess necessity is driving something of a levelling up of people becoming more what we term techno-cozy. And I guess we might have got there eventually, but this is happening faster and is quite useful in terms of developing the best use of these tools. And the more we share this information, the better we'll all get at this, I guess. However, I did want to touch on the elephant in the room. Other platforms are available. And a question I think we're all asking ourselves, and I'm hearing it in other walks of life as well, is will we all be consigned to video in the future because it's more cost effective? And I think the answer to that has to be no, it shouldn't be so. We are exploring a new tool, we're developing our understanding of that, but when we can put it back in the toolkit and have a wider range of tools, i.e. be able to be face-to-face again, then it is just a tool in the toolkit. Now, it might be that having experienced it and used it and understood it to a better level, that we will use it more. I suspect we will. But I think documentation covers this now and in the future. So we should be documenting what we're using and how and why. And we should be documenting the benefits and the disbenefits of doing so. Where are you making compromises and where are there benefits to the client and why? I know that certainly for my team, we're documenting that, and I know that there are several case management organisations keeping a wider list of information on the benefits and the compromises that are being made using these technologies. And I would encourage everyone to do that, because in that way we will be able to, in the future, determine what we're using for any given scenario or session and why. And I think that'll potentially be important. The other elephant in the room is about environment and what you want on show, and I'm sure we've all been quite entertained by what's in the background in politicians' houses and various other people, and I think the same is true for ourselves and for clients and families, in fact, and what you want on show. And I think something I've noticed and had a couple of conversations on is case managers finding the slightly lower level of formality that brings about, showing a small view of your home, can help with rapport. And it seems to have a positive impact alongside the shared lockdown experience. And this is particularly noted in relationships that might have been challenging previously. Whether it's sustainable in the future would be guesswork, but an interesting finding nonetheless. So how about remote assessment? What have we learned about that? Well, I think probably for myself and others, initially the thought was yeah, we can employ these new ways of working remotely with the clients that we know. But how's that going to work with somebody where we haven't got that pre-existing relationship, knowledge and rapport? And I haven't heard anyone say anything other than it works better than we expected. That may be because our expectations were not high. But that's great, isn't it? That we've all found that we can do this. Assessment doesn't have to stop because we're in lockdown. It may be changed, but it's not stopping. I think we're developing some accepted practice that assessment will be over more than one session. For anything quite complex, 2 to 3 sessions seems to be what everybody is arriving at and agreeing on. That thing again of pacing things and keeping the intensity at a level that people can manage. Remote assessment also requires its own setup. There's obviously the technical side of setup, as I spoke about before, but also providing introductory information beforehand so the client and household members know what to expect. And I don't mean at the beginning of the video call, I mean before that. And certainly it struck me that perhaps we should have done a better job sometimes at providing more information than we did before assessment anyway. It's quite new to a lot of people. So giving a sense of how long it might last, the kinds of things that you might be asking, that it's fine to stop if it's going to be tiring, etc. And making sure clients and household members are aware of what the session or sessions will be like. Gathering information and using it to plan our approach, I guess, is not new. But I think we often have a lot of information, not always, but often. And certainly, I think I myself and probably a lot of other people have preferred to read a little bit, but not have too many preconceived ideas before meeting somebody for the first time. Whereas I think if we do have a lot of information now, we're finding we're digging into that a bit more, particularly around cognitive issues, communication issues. It's helping to plan the approach a little bit more because of the bit that you're lacking that you can pick up when you first enter a situation. With remote assessment, there's obviously less environmental information available, and that's a theme that people return to often is the fact that you're not picking up what you would when you visit somebody in their own living circumstances. I don't think there are workarounds entirely, but asking to view parts of the home is something that could be done. But again, we need to explain beforehand that that's going to be the case, or explain in the assessment that you'd like to and do that at another time. Going back to the picking what's on view, you know, I've got some stuff on view here, but I'm not sure I'd like to turn the camera around the other way for you to see the rest of the room I've been working in for many weeks. Those that know me well will know I'm not a particularly tidy person. So again, just sort of thinking that through and a bit more planning we're finding we need to do. And finally, on remote assessment, wanting to make the point about ensuring the methodology we've used is very clear in the report. So the methodology is detailed, the weaknesses and blind spots are detailed, and putting in some kind of caveat, which I think we're pretty much doing now for every assessment, because it makes sense on the potential to revisit and review recommendations when things ease and we're able to do so. That seems a sensible approach. So there's a lot there in using the tools, but documenting that as well and being very careful to show your working so that we can reflect back on that at a future point. So the next aspect is to think about risk management and risk assessment, something that I think case managers have been doing a lot of. Case managers had a very busy March and beginning of April, I think universally, with a surge of risk assessment work. And those risk assessments remain under review and they're needing updating because the guidelines are changing. Lockdown is obviously starting to lift. We're expecting more change. And for each person, the responses for that particular situation for each client throw up different aspects within the risk assessment. So again, a more dynamic than usual scenario pretty much across the board. I'm not going to go into lots of depth on PPE, but obviously around risk assessment, there is the issue of obtaining PPE. We know that's universally a problem in the UK and beyond. I haven't gathered too many stories about huge difficulty on it, I must say. That's not to say there aren't any, and perhaps people might want to share some of their stories later on. But on the ground, I wonder whether when we're obtaining PPE for an individual and their team, whether that's actually perhaps a little bit easier to get in place than it is if you're doing it for a larger organisation. Certainly, we've been able to get things in place in advance. We've been able to find out which type is required, find local suppliers if we need them. There's certainly statutory bodies who can give advice and where you can get supplies from. I think we've had one occasion where we did use our network, knowing that we had good supply in one place and needing it in another, bit of begging and borrowing there. Hopefully that's going to ease as the situation improves. There's definitely been an aspect to the work of putting in place hospital passports or adjusting them, and the whole thinking around hospitalisation, whether for non-COVID or COVID-related aspects. I know at one stage it looked as though no support for clients would be possible. That's since been challenged, and at the very least we should be expecting individually made assessments and decisions. And to inform those with information and to advocate on that, again, is certainly an aspect for case management. I think when looking at risk assessment, considering what's essential for the individual is an interesting one, and essential means something different in almost every circumstance, one to the other and between people. That can be challenging to define and agree, and I think that's underpinning some of the risk assessment that we're needing to look at. But overall, risk assessment at the moment is about novel risks, and the COVID-19 risk not being entirely defined yet, and that raises more difficulties for our clients. And where risks are complex and novel, I think that we need to ensure the most appropriate team of people consider the risk, not feeling like it's a burden for one person. Ideally arriving at a consensus around decisions made, and then sharing these stories so we can learn from one another and build on the risk management and associated decision making around COVID-19 and the pandemic measures. If we'd known lockdown was coming, I guess we'd all have serviced all equipment and hoped nothing failed during the period. But as it lengthens, particularly for people shielded or in more vulnerable groups, there will surely be an increasing need to consider risk balancing equations around things like equipment maintenance and repair, non-urgent medical interventions, and face-to-face therapy for our clients. And we're starting to have these kinds of conversations. Because otherwise we're going to see increases in morbidity and mortality potentially. I don't think we yet have a collective experience and ways of practicing, and therefore a solid view on this. I think we have to develop this. Couple of areas of example in terms of non-urgent clinical risks. I was involved this week in a discussion with a care home manager who was debating the risk of hospital admission for a routine PEG change with delaying it. And they were feeling very under pressure to make this decision, and there may or may not have been some extra risks associated with it on the basis of the PEG not working perhaps as it should. So there we did exactly what I was talking about. We extended the team so that we asked the district nurse and the PEG nurse to become involved to advise on the balance of risk, and the decision to attend the day case was made with reassurances about how that risk would be minimised. And in fact, it was just the one doctor that did the procedure yesterday that met them, and that was the only person they saw at the hospital. And then nursing advice to the care home on additional steps to the care plan on return to reduce risk to the client and others. So that was an extended, small but extended team of decision makers to manage that risk in a way that probably wouldn't have happened beforehand because it wouldn't have been a hugely risky issue to have considered. When we're risk assessing around necessary and compliant equipment maintenance, I think that's something that's beginning to come up, and it may be worth seeking support from equipment suppliers and manufacturers. Are they experiencing different stories around this? For portable equipment, can it be serviced or fixed in a car park, a garage, a driveway? We've certainly had some experience of something being fixed in a driveway recently. If it's in situ, such as an overhead hoist, can the client be elsewhere while it occurs and their room deep cleaned? Is there an alternative that can be loaned or hired? A question I don't have an answer to, but is, do our insurers have any examples of others they may be picking up from contacts with the people they insure on stories of concern and how those problems are being tackled? Once all the options are considered in the mix, I think there'll still be hard decisions to make, but over time we will form a body of decision making which is going to build. If you're the first one to make that kind of decision, that's not easy, but you might not be the first one. So again, I'd say it's about sharing, it's about attending some of the network discussions and finding out if anyone else has already trodden that route. Briefly, I'm going to touch on issues of capacity, not in great detail. There are people who know far more about this field than I, and there are some webinars specifically on this. And I'd guide you to government guidance, NHS websites, and also 39 Essex Street website, which I found extremely useful. There's some great webinars and information on there. I'm aware that there is specific COVID guidance, and mostly around practicalities of assessment, but the main principles, as I understand it, remain. And I think, again, it comes down to case managers sometimes being the advocating voice for that if that hasn't been fully understood. But again, we're not unused to doing that. You might need to consider whether individuals are now more restricted in terms of goals, and that may need to be reviewed. And remote capacity assessments may need to be done. Now, we've had some done remotely. We've also had clinicians reluctant to do them remotely. I was on a webinar recently and I heard Alex Ruck-Keene suggest that remote capacity assessment is probably better than none, and that feels right. And I think additionally, it feels to me as though for a lot of our clients, we have an awful lot of information, perhaps previous capacity assessments on similar issues. There's quite a lot to go on often. And that may actually be a better position than many who perhaps don't have quite such a body of information gathered together behind them. And of course, if we are doing remote capacity assessment and we are concerned that it's not as good, then as soon as we are able to, that could be revised with an in-person capacity assessment. But I think the guidance is pretty clear that you wouldn't be doing it in person at the moment unless you really had to. A few other aspects of supporting and protecting the vulnerable during the pandemic. Shielded clients. If you have shielded clients, probably a lot of the audience know this, but they should have had a letter. There is a national algorithm that you can, on the gov.uk website, you can plug their information into and find out whether they should have had a letter. And if they don't, but you still have concerns about a high level of vulnerability not quite covered by that, then the point of contact should be the GP who can decide whether to send them a letter. The point about the letter is that that group then receives specific information relevant to their circumstances. It gives access to certain types of support, and the letter is proof that they're shielded should that be needed. Oh, I think I missed, did I miss something? Yes, I missed lots of things, sorry. So, back one there. We have lots of clients with other vulnerabilities, those needing one-to-one contact, behaviours that challenge, low mood, motivational issues, the people that break rules, anxious people, conspiracy theorists even. I've heard about 2 of those recently in our client group. it can help to take a copy of the care plan or guidelines out with them, and that might be something that people supporting them could be encouraged to do, and that may help manage any situation if they get into difficulty with the authorities whilst out. We've been doing a bit of thought and work around clear, simple explanations in appropriate format to help orientate clients to the current situation or to future situations if, for example, they may be at some point surrounded by people in PPE. A specific point on adapted PPE for lip readers. I believe originally it wasn't possible to get clear face masks and the visors are having to be used, but I think there is somewhere that now provides the masks with a window in them, a clear window. And then finally, in supporting and protecting, not finally because I'm sure the list could go on and on, but I was thinking particularly about that support and instruction to the care teams and household members, the people who are in one-to-one contact, and how much more work there has been to put things in place to ensure that they can do that and be the proxy for other people, such as therapy teams, for example. Which brings me on to just another aspect, really, of supporting those supporters, by whom I mean the carers and support workers, other people in the household, but also managers of services of care organisations, of care homes, and case managers, our peers, and people within our networks who are doing the most amazing job to keep clients safe and well and delivering remote input and noticing and highlighting concerns and new issues. I should have put therapists on that list as well. Many apologies to all the therapists on the webinar. And making the point really that it's a bit like being on an aircraft when you get that instruction to look after yourself before you look after others. And I think there's a huge amount of that we need to do. We need to be supporting each other. We're not going to be going on any aircraft anytime soon, I don't suppose. But there's a massively increased need to be supporting everybody within this network and ensuring that we can each of us do the job, really because we're all on that Coronacoaster together. So thinking forward a little bit more to a point where life in lockdown is more relaxed, as actually it has changed in the last week since I wrote that first point. But firstly, thinking about greater difficulty for those with cognitive challenges if the guidelines are less precise. And the need to, again, look individually with each person at what does that mean and putting in place perhaps a set of guidelines for the individual. That means renewed risk assessments, as I said, at each stage. I've had more than one conversation with people in case management about forward planning for a possible second peak. I'm sure that's something none of us would like to think would happen, but it appears to be a distinct possibility. Also, multiple conversations about what the world might look like the other side of this, and whether we may have lost some provider services, and whether there will be limited options for clients. Not entirely possible to see at the moment, but something to have on our radar. Certainly, it feels as though it could be different. We know there are going to be huge post-COVID rehab needs and mental health issues, both for people who've had COVID-19, but also just because across the board, private sector and state, rehab and mental health services have not been able to do what they would have been doing, so it's been slowed up for all. There's also the thought that state support for health and care services may be different on the other side of this. And different in what way is impossible to say at the moment. Better, worse, some kind of a mixture, don't know, but it feels unlikely that it would be quite as we have known it. So we have to, I suppose, wait and see. But I hope through this talk I've given a sense that there might be some silver linings in some of the things that we've been experiencing and learning, and I'm sure there are more than are on this slide, but I thought it was good to finish on a positive. That we are building expertise with new tools. We are gaining new insights into our clients. we're certainly finding we're making new connections and we're improving relationships, not only with clients and family members, but I think professionally too. I think it's true to be said there's less paper and more online efficiency now, and it seems hard to think we would want to go backwards from that. And perhaps most importantly of all, it feels as though there's an equity of esteem for key workers, and obviously our clients rely heavily on key workers, care workers particularly, and that does feel like quite a silver lining. Silver linings that can be sustained? I'd like to think so. So I'm going to stop there, and I know you're going to get a copy of these slides. So a few of the sources of information I've used here are on this slide, as well as some thanks. There are probably more people than this, but there are people who've informed my thinking, really, and I hope sharing some of that thinking has been useful. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Laura now.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I think that was a really helpful summary of where we're at and what we've been dealing with in terms of case management from a COVID-19 perspective. I'm sure the really juicy bit of this conversation is now the litigation aspect of COVID-19. I know, being a serious injury solicitor, one of the most common questions I'm constantly being asked is, how is COVID-19 impacting on the progression of personal injury cases? And to be honest with you, it'll take more than a global pandemic to stop solicitors at Irwin Mitchell working. So that's the first response. But the second response is there are some things that are outside of our control that are having some impact. And we've had to come up with some creative and quick solutions to do that. The good thing for us at Irwin Mitchell is we were geared up to working in an agile and electronic fashion for the majority of the time. So we didn't necessarily feel the pain that most of us felt when lockdown was announced. Although there is some pain when you realise you're stuck with your loved one for an enforced period of time. I don't know if anyone else has had the question, why do you type so loudly and why do you breathe so loudly? So I feel the pain if you're also getting the same as me. Some of the key issues that I've noticed, and certainly colleagues have raised, are those that are listed on the screen in front of you. Now, they're not the only issues, I'm fully aware, but I thought these were the ones that are more likely to have some delay or some issues that allow us to progress cases. So starting from the top, defendant insurers and interim payments. I've spoken to a lot of defendant insurers recently, and the position seems to be quite mixed. Some insurers are still working at full capacity, and some have furloughed high proportions of staff, to the point where I was on the phone last week, so on Niche Insurer, to be told the entire catastrophic injury team had been furloughed, which was extremely helpful. So this obviously has put increased pressure on the insurers who are still at work and has resulted in delays. So we can't get responses from insurers directly, or it's taken them some time to respond to us. And defendant solicitors are also having some difficulties obtaining instructions. Now, those delays aren't just relative to general case progression, but it can also have impacts on obtaining interim payments. However, that sounds a bit doom and gloom. It's not. There are a couple of issues for some clients, but in the vast majority, we have been shifting to collaborative working with defendant solicitors over recent years. So we've managed to build some really good relationships with insurers and solicitors. So for the vast majority, things are business as usual with interim payments, with some slight delays, but overall we're still continuing to get money through. And for those that are still conducting litigation in the old school adversarial manner, we are having to make interim payment applications, and we're having some issues getting those listed at court because there are some slight delays at the courts as well, but more on that in a moment. Liability investigations is what I would probably like to call the domino effect at the minute. So a lot of serious injury clients, unfortunately, are involved in road traffic accidents. So in those circumstances, we're relying on police documents to understand the nature of the accident and our stance regarding liability. But quite often, seriously injured clients don't remember the accident, and sometimes we don't have witnesses other than the defendant to give us the information. So you can see why police documents are important. The caveat to that is we can't get those documents until criminal proceedings have concluded if they are being pursued. So, following lockdown, there were some delays with the criminal court because trials were adjourned. However, recent information is suggesting that a lot of the criminal hearings are now being held virtually. And so I think we're starting to see a movement as things progressing a bit quicker. However, I think we're still lagging behind and there's a bit of a delay there. So if you are instructed on any cases where clients might have had accidents in the last 6 to 12 months, particularly those trickier and Mitchell cases where it's a pedestrian walking home from a night out at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning on a dark road, we might have some issues there because defendant insurers don't like to release interim payments or admit liability until they get sight of the police document. But again, sounds a bit doom and gloom. It's not. There are things we can do to support those clients during the time. So I know some of the case managers and therapists that we have great relationships with will work on a deferred fee payment. Deferred fee payment. And we also have our internal client liaison manager service who can assist in maximising entitlement to statutory services. So we can still do things even if we're struggling to get those police documents. In terms of the court, the courts, I think, felt the pain when we went into lockdown. They weren't particularly geared up to work electronically. There were some pilot schemes going on pre-lockdown, but by no means was that on a national scale. So they've had an absolutely mammoth task on their hands to move to some form of electronic system. The first 8 weeks, I think we experienced quite a lot of delays, particularly up north. However, we're starting to see a bit of movement. And certainly as personal injury lawyers are now working in a very strange way with the courts by doing everything electronically. So now we're seeing virtual court hearings, including trials, filing of e-bundles, we're issuing court proceedings online, and we've even got extensions to our current ability to extend court deadlines from 28 days to 56 days without making applications to court. Now that all sounds not very exciting, I appreciate, but for us, this is completely different. It's a new world. So there's lots of things within the court system that aren't going to be covered by the recent guidance to do with COVID-19. So what we are trying to do is to consider cases on the facts and agree a sensible approach with the defendant solicitor. It is easier said than done to do that with some defendant solicitors, but in my experience, the vast majority are working collaboratively and being sensible at this time. Disclosure is probably a word that case managers and therapists can't stand because when we request disclosure, you've got to get all of your records over to us. Now, you guys are stars because you've been working electronically for a really long time, and that just makes our lives so much easier with not having to deal with post, paper, scanning, all of that stuff. What we did think might have been an issue was obtaining records from the NHS. I don't know if you thought about it, but they are under pressure with some other more important things at the minute. Surprisingly, I've been extremely impressed with the NHS. GPs, hospitals, NHS trusts are giving us records electronically and in the majority of circumstances within the Data Protection Act timescales, which is fantastic. So we're not seeing now vast amounts of issues with disclosure. There are still some cases where we can't get records electronically, but overall we are doing that. We've also supported our clients to create e-signatures. I needed a lot of training with that. And they're now liaising with us via email to reduce the post or the need to go to the post box. We also have the Irwin Mitchell version of the cloud called Share. Some of you might know about it. Again, super exciting. We can share documents safely and securely with anyone online who would choose to. The last two are probably the trickier two in order to progress cases, but it still means we are doing something. So medical legal expert appointments. If you are working with our clients at the moment, no doubt you will have had us on the phone saying, can we do an appointment via Skype or by Zoom or whatever other means we might be able to. Essentially, whether medical legal expert appointments can go ahead is dependent on the field of the expert, the client's injuries, and the stage of the case. So in terms of the field of the expert, Some are willing to assess clients remotely, and again, it has to be subject to the client's consent to prepare the report. However, this can sometimes be with the caveat that a face-to-face appointment will be required post-lockdown. So it doubles the amount of appointments the client's got to attend, and also some of the legal costs in the case. So we need to think really carefully when virtual assessments are offered and just consider it on its own unique facts. And I'll explain why that's important in terms of the stage of the case in a moment. On the cases I've worked on, experts in fields of psychiatry, accommodation, and care and occupational therapy have been taking appointments remotely. Again, with the caveat, face-to-face may be required in due course. Good experts in fields such as neuropsychology or anything physical like orthopedics, spinal injury, neuro-ophthalmology aren't appropriate to be conducted virtually for obvious reasons. In terms of the client's injuries, some of our clients are so seriously injured that it's not appropriate for them to attend a virtual appointment. We've also got issues such as the video fatigue, which Vicky touched upon earlier. And we've also had clients who just don't feel comfortable meeting essentially a stranger on camera in their home environment. And again, we need to think about those cases and those appointments on their own individual facts. So the stage of the case is important because if an expert has assessed our client previously and is preparing an update report, well, they might be happy to conduct a virtual-only appointment. If it's an initial appointment, the chances are the expert's going to want to see the client at a face-to-face appointment post-lockdown. And that's especially true if one party, so if the claimants have managed to get a face-to-face appointment and the defendants haven't. What we can do in cases where the client's injuries determine they can't attend a virtual appointment or the field of the expert says, I can't do anything virtually, is we can get a desktop report in certain circumstances, which is helpful in giving us a bit of a steer as to the evidence, so rehab needs or causation of injuries, and it can also help us progress in those cases, such as issuing court proceedings where medical evidence is required. So again, there's not a broad brush approach to expert appointments. It's very much dependent on the expert, the client's injuries and the stage of the case, but speak to the solicitors who are organising those appointments if you want to go through that in any more detail. Accommodation claims. Well, this was the bane of most personal injury lawyers' lives prior to lockdown. So I won't bore you with the details, but there is quite a big case called Swift and Carpenter, which is rumbling through the Court of Appeal at the moment and due to be heard in June. That is to do with the methodology that we apply to the calculation of accommodation claims. So there was always some delay in tactics from defendants until that case has been heard, and we've got judgment, which hopefully will be by the end of the summer. So we've got that to contend with, but in addition, we've also got some issues post-lockdown. So let's think about community living trials and purchasing properties. Well, the property market has been pretty stagnant over the last 8 weeks. There are some changes starting to take place, which I'll come across shortly. But a lot of our clients who are at that stage of their rehab, where they were about to think about community living trials, so we needed to rent somewhere for 6 months, or they've done that and they were looking at purchasing a property, they've not been able to do anything realistically in the last 8 weeks. We've had some good situations where we've been able to look at virtual property viewing and assessing suitability of properties until purchase can be made. But surveys weren't being done or they were being delayed, so there has generally been delays with that. However, the recent government guidance has started to push things along in the property market. So over the coming weeks, I think we'll start to see some more movement on that. If you are a case manager, please make sure you've got suitable risk assessment. If you are taking clients to view properties, and make sure you're thinking about the logistics of any planned house moves over the coming months. The other thing to think about with accommodation is adapting properties. So we have a few clients who own their properties, but they need substantial adaptations to be carried out. So emergency adaptations to kit, equipment, those kinds of things, which Vicky talked on earlier, they can still happen, subject to the appropriate risk assessment. But what about extensions, changes to roofs, wet rooms, kitchen adaptations? Well, again, it's pretty much been on hold for the last 8 weeks. But now we've got the encouragement of the construction workers to go back to work, it might be that we start to see a shift in that as well. Again, we really need to think about the best ways to support our clients during that time. And if we can't make those adaptations to properties, what suitable equipment or short-term solutions can we think of while we wait for those larger adaptations to take place? So, if you're still awake, that was the litigation update. So from that, it pretty much is business as usual with some of the caveats above, but nothing is essentially a bar to cases progressing at the moment. We're just coming up with some creative solutions to try and get round them. So I'm conscious we're nearly at the 1 hour mark, so I'll just very quickly have a look to see if we've got any questions and if I can work that out. Okay, so broad question. How has coronavirus impacted your daily lives and tasks? And is there a coping strategy you found useful? So when I first saw that, I jokingly said to Vicky, well, semi-jokingly, the fridge was my coping strategy to begin with. However, now I've had to change things to the gym. So there are times when I just don't want to do things and don't want to be productive, but routine is the key for me, and knowing that you're going to have bad days and pick yourself up the next day and hope it's going to be a better day is the only way forward. Don't know what your thoughts are on that, Vicky?
Yeah, I think routine was the first thing that struck me as well, and I think that's something we're also advocating to our clients. It really helps with the underpinnings. But I think also I found myself having a lot of conversations with colleagues, with clients, family members, also with my friends, also with myself, about the idea that you just get through it the best way you can. And everyone's doing that change curve thing, and sometimes you have a good day, sometimes you have a bad day, as you say. And, you know, you don't have to write a book or create something amazing or even finish the to-do list. You just get through it the best way you can, routine to underpin that, but I guess just not having huge expectations of yourself or anyone else, because it's pretty tricky for everybody.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm sure we're all...
And lipstick, for me, lipstick.
Yes, I would agree with that.
I don't know why, but, you know, whatever makes you feel better, in other words.
Always makes you feel better when you brush your hair and put some lipstick on, doesn't it? Just really quickly, there's a question in here for me, unless, Vicky, you want to answer this one. But the question is, are trials and settlement meetings still taking place during COVID-19? And if so, how? The short answer to that is yes, absolutely. We've had some really good results with settlement meetings taking place by phone, and actually clients have really enjoyed being in their own home environment and being able to nip off and make a cup of tea or hang up if things get a bit difficult. So we're getting some really good results from that. Trials are happening. In our serious injury cases, the trials are really, really long. We've got some logistical issues with that, but the general consensus is if we can, then we should, but keep reviewing it as we go.
Yeah, so, I'd echo that. We had 2 settle last week, one within mediation, and I think that was across 2 separate mediation meetings, but using Zoom and having separate Zoom rooms, so the client and her case manager could go into a Zoom room and just discuss and then come back to the rest of the meeting. Again, one of those things that we wondered how it would be, but it was absolutely superb, worked really well. The client found it really useful and good. Yeah.
So again, creative solutions, we are managing to get by on things, which is great. I'm conscious we're now 1 minute over, so if you do have any other questions we weren't able to deal with today, by all means, you can drop us an email. And if by magic, I've jumped a little bit ahead, Natasha, next one, the Erwin Mitchell email address you can send those questions to are there. Thanks everyone for taking the time to join us. I hope that has helped. Like we said, this webinar is part of a series of Erwin Mitchell webinars, so we'd love to hear what you think, and if there are any other topics that you'd like to cover, make sure you get on that email address. And if you have any questions about legal or financial queries relating to the coronavirus outbreak, again, as if by magic, there's the website for you to have a look at. And there's also the links that Vicky had talked about earlier to do with case managers getting support and sharing information. And again, we'll make sure those links are circulated to you. So finally, before you jump off the webinar or grab another biscuit or 3, if you're like me, please do leave us your feedback from today. It will pop up automatically when you select leave meetings, so no excuses. And the last thing to say is thank you, stay safe, and keep up the amazing work you do in supporting the people who need us most. Thanks very much, everyone.